Welcome to Christian Dawah. Today we're going to be refuting a common Islamic argument against the Trinity. So, I hope this is something that you enjoy. Welcome along. Despite the fact that Muslims so strongly disagree with the doctrine of the Trinity, I found that a lot of Muslim scholars and apologists are actually unable to give a convincing and methodical argument against the logic of the doctrine of the Trinity. However, today, that's not the case. Today, we're going to be analyzing a very interesting argument brought by a pretty popular Muslim YouTuber called the Muslim Metaphysician. And this is a YouTuber whose name is Jake, and he brings a fascinating take on an argument against the logical nature of the Trinity. And so in this video, we're going to look at what Jake's argument is, and then I'm going to demonstrate how his argument is fallacious and why arguments of this type fail to work in general. So let's dive right in.
Here, I have here the logical problem of the Trinity. The first statement is that the Father is God. Okay? This is not controversial. None of these 7 statements are controversial for a Trinitarian. Okay? So, the Father is God. The Son is also God. The Holy Spirit is God. That's premise number 3. The Father is not the Son. So the Father and the Son are not the same thing. The Father is also not the Holy Spirit. And then we have premise 6 here. The Son is not the Holy Spirit. Premise 7, there is exactly one God. In the first 3 statements, we have the Father is God. So we have one is God statement. The Son is God. Second is God statement. The Holy Spirit is God. Third is God statement. Standard Trinitarian theology says that the Father is not the Son, the Father is not the Holy Spirit, the Son is not the Holy Spirit. Now, if these 3 aren't the same, and we have each one of them being is God statements, then it looks like we have 1 plus 1 plus 1 equals 3 is God statements. We have 3 is God statements, not only 1 is God statement. So I have here an analogy of the LPT. Okay? Now, here we have Jake is a man, or Jake is man. John is man. James is man. Jake is not John. Jake is not James. John is not James. And number 7, the 7th premise, there is /r, because I'm leaving this open for now, exactly 1 or 3 men or man. Typically, if we were to read this apart from considering the Trinity, we would say there are exactly 3 men. But instead, what you have in the Trinity is you would have this same formula. Instead of saying there are 3 men or 3 gods, you have there is exactly 1 man. Now, for us, that seems absurd because our typical way of counting men, or gods in this case, would result in there being 3, not 1. 3 men and not 1 man.
So, the first problem with this argument that Jake offers is that he doesn't actually properly understand or define what he means by the word is. Now, I know what you're thinking. Oh, come on. How can you talk about the meaning of the word is? This is crazy. But actually, this is a very important philosophical and linguistic topic. And that's because the word is actually does have several different possible meanings and several possible usages in English. For example, there is what's known as the copula, or copula is a fancy linguistic way of saying is, but there's a copula of identity, which is to say x is identical to y. So if we said, for example, the square root of 9 is 3, that is a copula of identity. That is to say that the square root of 9 is identical to 3. And that means that this copula of identity, for example, is reversible. You could just say 3 is the square root of 9. It goes both ways. and it doesn't really matter which way you phrase the sentence. There's also copula of composition. For example, to say that statue is marble. We're not saying the statue is identical to marble or that the statue equals marble. Rather, we would say that the statue is composed of marble. And so that is a copula of composition. And then thirdly, there are copula of predication. Now, what we mean by predication is that there is a subject and then there's a predicate. That is to say that there's a subject which is doing the action and then a predicate which is either describing the subject or describing what the subject is doing. And so an example of that would be, for example, that we could say that Charles is king. Charles is king. In that case, we're not saying that Charles is identical to king because he's not identical to king. You can't flip it around and say king is Charles. No, because there are kings who aren't Charles. So they're not identical. It's not like the same thing that we saw earlier where we saw 3 and the square root of 9 are identical. No, king and Charles are not identical, but king is a predicate of the subject Charles. When we use copula of predication, what we actually mean is something to the effect of X has the relevant characteristics of Y. So if we go back to the example of Charles as the king, when we say Charles is king, we don't mean Charles is identical to king or Charles is made up of king, like a copula of composition. Rather, what we mean is Charles is a person who has all of the relevant attributes of king. Right? He was crowned. He is from the right lineage. He has the title given to him by the government, for example. And so those relevant attributes are the things that belong to Charles. Therefore, Charles is king. It's a predicate. It's not identity. Okay. So now that we've dealt with this issue of the meaning of the word is, let's go back to Jake's argument against the Trinity. Now, at the beginning, we're going to start off with his example argument, and then we're going to move over to the real argument about God. And I think what we're going to show is that, unfortunately, Jake has made 2 glaring errors in his formulation of the argument, and that's going to basically render his argument completely invalid. So the first error that he makes here is that he doesn't properly explicate his terms. He doesn't properly state his premises in a clear way. What he says is Jake is man, John is man, James is man. Those ises there are not ises of identity because you can't reverse them, right? Identity must be reversible, like 1 + 1 = 2, 2 = 1 + 1, you can reverse them. You can't do that here. You can't say man is Jake or man is James because man isn't James. James is not the only man or Jake is not the only man. There are other men other than Jake or James. So man is not identical to James. So this is not an identity statement. Rather, this is a statement of predication. This is a copula of predication. So the is here does not mean is identical to. Rather, what the is here means is Jake is a person who has the attributes of man. He has the relevant attributes, namely, he has the body of a man. He is a man in that way. So John is a person with the attributes of man, and James is a person with the attributes of man. And so we can see here that there are 3 copula of predication. So that's the first issue, that he does not properly state the first 3 premises in a way that is clear and obvious. So other than not accurately stating his premises, the other problem that Jake has is that his argument actually contains a hidden premise. And this hidden premise, when stated, is actually going to be devastating for his argument. Let's look and see. So he gives us 6 premises and then a final conclusion, or a final premise. And he says, this doesn't make sense. You can't have them all together. But actually, there is one more premise that he does not state. And so let's look at this argument again. So let's say Jake is a person with the attributes of man, premise 1. John is a person with the attributes of man, premise 2. James is a person with the attributes of man, premise 3. Jake is not identical to John. Jake is not identical to James. And James is not identical to John. So we have basically 3 persons who all are man. So the question is, there are 3 persons who are not each other, who are not identical to each other, but they're all man. Now the question is, how many men are there? The added premise that should be there, and that is there in the subtext, is given that a man is the type of being which is by its nature unipersonal, only has one person, there are 3 men. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is this whole argument only works if a man is the type of being that only has one person. If every one man has one person, then that makes sense because you have three different persons, right? James, Jake, and John, and each of them identifies as man, and none of them are identical to each other. And so, therefore, if a man is the kind of being that only has one person, then there must be three men. Now, you might see the problem with this here. We're talking about God as the Trinity, and this commits the fallacy of begging the question, which is to assume the conclusion of an argument in one of the premises. And if this is what's happening, this renders Jake's argument logically invalid. So now that we've seen the two mistakes that Jake has made, one, not accurately stating his premises, and two, including a hidden premise, which commits the fallacy of begging the question, or it assumes the conclusion in itself, we can now move on to the actual argument against the Trinity. So what does Jake say here? Premise one, the Father is a person with the attributes of deity. Now, you could say, this is another way of phrasing what he says is the Father is God, but like I showed you already, that's inaccurate. It's more accurate because this is a copula of predication and not identity. It's more accurate to say the Father is a person with the attributes of God. The problem is in English we also use God as a personal name. So for the sake of clarity, I decided to use the word deity because we're not talking about a personal name here. We're talking about a type of being. That God in this case means a type of being. Not the personal name of that being. So, the Father is a person with the attributes of deity. The Son is a person with the attributes of deity. The Holy Spirit is a person with the attributes of deity. So we have three persons who all have the attributes of deity, because it's all three copula of predication. Then, premise 4, the Father is not identical to the Son. The Father is not identical to the Holy Spirit. And the Father is not identical to, and the Son is not identical to the Holy Spirit. Okay, so we have three persons, the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, all of whom have the attributes of deity, but none of whom are identical to each other. So, therefore, according to Jake, therefore, there must be three deities. However, we need to include the hidden premise that he's sneaking in. If we include that, this was what it would say. It would say, given that a deity is the type of being which by its nature is unipersonal, therefore, there are three deities. You see the problem here. The problem here is that this is assuming Unitarianism in the argument. That if you assume that God must be a type of being that only has one person per being, then yes, Jake's argument 100% works. It totally destroys the Trinity. But that's assuming the conclusion in your premise. Because, for example, if we just zoom out for a second, if we look at this whole argument together and we say, okay, there are three persons who all exhibit the attributes of deity and they're not identical to each other. Therefore, how many deities are there? The first question to ask is what do we mean by deity? What are the attributes of deity? What does it mean for something to be God? And if in one of those statements we say, well, one of the things about God is that we don't know how many persons are in God. We don't know, because that's what we're debating, right? We're debating, I think it's three persons, the Muslim think it's one person, so for the sake of neutrality, we'll say, well, what we're trying to figure out is how many persons are in God. Well, then, the fact that we have three persons that all identify as deity, or that have all the attributes of deity, that in no way follows that there must be three deities. And so we see here that Jake's argument against the Trinity completely fails, because in its key premise, it is assuming that the Trinity is not possible, which of course is to beg the question, which renders his argument invalid. If you've watched the video this far, you're probably a keener who loves delving into philosophical detail. And if you're that kind of person, you might have thought, as I've been speaking here, that the argument that I'm giving, or the counter argument that I'm giving, is somewhat ad hoc, that I'm just kind of making up these categories of types of types of a difference between person and being, that kind of stuff, in order to defend the Trinity specifically. But actually, I would like to quickly give an example that shows that no, this is actually a well-founded argument, and that this makes sense even if we apply it to a different topic other than men or if we run Jake the Muslim Metaphysician's argument with another item, it will also show that this argument does not work. So here's how. If I say Jake is a person with the attributes of a rock, John is a person with the attributes of rock. James is a person with the attributes of rock. Jake is not identical to John, Jake is not identical to James, and James is not identical to John. How many rocks are there? How many rocks are there? Well, when we say rock, what is a rock? A rock is the type of, is a being. It has existence, therefore it's a being. The rock is a thing that does not have any person in it. It's not unipersonal or tripersonal. It's non-personal. It's apersonal. And so, if we include the hidden premise here, given that a rock is the type of being that is non-personal, according to this argument, there are 0 rocks. There are 0 rocks, because if I say Jake is a person with the attributes of rock, therefore I've already made a contradiction, right? I've said a person with the attributes of rock. Well, a person who has the attributes of rock is not a rock, because a rock is apersonal by definition. And so we can see here that Jake's entire argument comes down to the question of what our preconceived notion of what the being we're talking about is. If we already know that the being is either unipersonal or tripersonal or apersonal, that completely impacts the end point of the argument. It completely impacts the conclusion of the argument. And so this just hopefully shows us that actually Jake's argument is entirely resting on the assumption of what kind of being God is. And of course, you can't do that if your argument is trying to establish what kind of being God is. So, since Jake's argument is logically invalid, it doesn't leave us anywhere closer to understanding the truth. Basically, it all comes down to what your source for your information on who God is comes from. If you take your source from the Bible clearly teaches that God is 3 persons who are not identical to each other, but who all have the attributes of deity, and that also that God is one. And so that information leads us to conclude that God is triune. If you don't accept the Bible, then that's fine. You don't accept the Trinity. I have no problem with that. But what you can't say is that the Trinity is logically invalid or logically impossible, because as we've just shown, it's actually not. It's not logically invalid, not logically impossible. There's no logical problem with it. The only question is, do you trust the source that we get this doctrine from? Anyway, I hope this video has been helpful for you. I'm going to be making a video, I'm in the process of making a video right now on prophecies in the Quran. So if you are a Muslim or a Christian or anyone, and you have some fascinating prophecies in the Quran that came true or that were proven true, please put them in the comments and I will hopefully try to address them in my next video. But until then, I hope that the Lord blesses you and your family greatly. Thanks for watching.